near-death experiences. Everyone around the world has acknowledged that when people are nearing death, have things happen which are unexplainable. And this video is going to look at when I had my near-death experience. I wanted to take it from a child's perspective, but also an adult's perspective. This is what I felt Freya was trying to tell me, that it's not just about the near-death experience, but the ethics and the attitudes and the thoughts behind it, because those that do pass away cannot come back and tell us if these are figments of imagination or the truth. Now, the way I want to start, guys, is to look at the beliefs of others. Now, if you go pre-Viking times, way back, you come across the tribes of the Sami people. Now, they didn't have the Viking gods and goddesses as such. They did have gods and goddesses, and some of them were probably relatable, but they had a different outlook on death and what happens. And you have to also remember, this is pre-Bronze Age as well. So you have your Bronze Age, then your Iron Age, then your Scandinavian Iron Age, which comes before the Viking era. They inhabited North Europe, and that took in on it Norway, Finland, Sweden and Russia for over 5,000 years. You can understand their belief systems were slightly different. When they died, they had this belief that they were going to live again in a world called Salvo. And this world would be very much like the world they lived in, but everything would be more abundant. There would be an abundance of food, of living, of joy, and so they had no fear about passing away. So you can see how belief systems can have a big effect on a person mentally. If we look at Christianity, they have a belief system of going to either hell or heaven. And of course, the modern day Christians tend to believe more in going to heaven, because back in the Middle Ages, it was more deemed about sin and everything that went with that. Your death would be judged on what you did every day. And so their beliefs were in a heaven. Now, if we come forwards, we then have, obviously, the Viking era. And so in the gods came in all the stories and the sagas and everything around that. And that then brought in a new way of looking at things. We still had a world similar to ours, which was run by the goddess Hel. And people had to journey to it and get past the gates to get in. We also had a sort of combination that would help everybody believe in some way. For the warriors, there was Valhalla. For the warriors that didn't quite get up to scratch, maybe they would end up in Folkvanga. For others, it would be a sleep, but they could be talked to and brought back by the gods, or anyone that had magical aspirations. So you see, it's a wide belief system, and their burials were all different as well. If you go through the Viking era, you find that there's mounds, but there was also burnings. You can see the difference in that too. Now, the reason I'm bringing all this up, guys, is because When I had my near-death experience, I was only 11 years old, and all I knew was what I'd been taught at school and some stories. And so when it happened to me, the things that I saw and heard were looked at in that way rather than any other way. But today I want to tell you the story and then try and put it into my perspective now. The other point I want to make is that people think that the angels, the angelics, are just in the Christian Bible, and that is not true. They are beings of strength and ability and love, but also war, also justice, also strong. And these are here because they want to be, not because some God in the heavens has told them to be. Now this is looking at it from my belief system, okay, and from what I've learned over the years. Now that is why I often bring in on some of the stuff I do about the angelics, because they are a powerful tool and a companion in some ways. We are taught the basics in the Bible about them, but if you study up on them from other areas, they are very, 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 very powerful, and they are drawn to us for some reason. They have their own place that they live, and they have their own ways, and so that is why I use them. I'm going to go now into the story. You have to remember this was 1971 and I was 11 years old. I was a diabetic, type 1, and I still am, which was classified a disease. It was only 25 years earlier that people were dying for lack of treatment, and so it was early days, anyone that had that condition, to get them through minor operations. When I was taken ill at school that particular day with terrible pains in my stomach, I was taken firstly to the doctors, and the doctor sent me via my parents straight into this ward which where other children were, and the doctors came round and they looked at my stomach and pressed here and there, and they said, oh yeah, it seems like you have an appendix and we need to do an operation. So the doctor took my dad to one side and explained, you know, it is risky because it looks like it might burst. Being diabetic, they don't know how the anaesthetic will react. So my dad signed a form, obviously it had to be done, and I was terrified. But I think it was probably a couple of hours later, they took me down to theatre. And I remember when I was in the theatre, I was looking around the room because I was frightened, and I was probably looking for a way out, to be honest. This nurse came up and she picked me up off the bed and she held me as if to comfort me, but to me it was like they were trying to grab hold of me, and I struggled, and they put a face mask on, and I was remembering the last bit was struggling to breathe. I was out. Now the next thing I remember, guys, I was in the theatre again, and I was looking. On the wall was this clock, and I always remember it was like one of those old-fashioned white clocks with big black letters and hands, and I could hear it ticking, tick tock, tick tock, and I'm thinking, that's so weird. I then realised I was on the wall, literally hovering, and I was only a child, didn't understand what was going on. I remember I looked down, and there I was on the table, and people were running round. There was doctors, and there was one particular nurse I remember feeling a little bit annoyed because she had some hair that was sticking up. She had her hat on and two clips holding her hair in, and there was a lump of hair sticking up, and I just wanted to go over and pull it down and tuck it in. I don't know if time had elapsed, but I was going past the stairwell. Now I was in a sort of laying down, sitting up position, and I was floating, and I didn't think I had any control over this because I couldn't really stand up, and I couldn't really, it was like being in water but air, if that makes sense, and I couldn't really control myself. So in the old hospital of Kings, the old type, the sort of lift had like the stairwell would come up and go around and up to the next floor, and so the stairwell was there and you'd have the steps. And as I was making my way through these doors, I saw a man standing on the stair. Now everybody else had pushed past and walked through me, and it was quite weird. But this man saw me, and I was like, help, I'm scared. This voice came into my head and said, you will be fine, you will be okay. And I felt calm. I looked at this man, but he'd gone, and the doors were shut, and I was so scared I was going to go bang into them. I found myself not going through the doors, but it was as if one minute I was here, next minute I was there. I was above my bed in the ward, and just sort of laying there. I remember looking at the lights in the ceiling, counting how many there were, seeing the long windows with they had curtains up, remembering that one of them had a broken curtain. And as I sort of came down a bit, that man was standing at the bottom of my bed, and he was just standing there with his hands like that. And he was the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. He had crystal blue eyes, so pale they were like pools of water. And his smile was so beautiful. And he went like that with his hands. He was standing with an oval-shaped doorway around him, which had bits coming in that almost looked like it had been designed as a photo frame, if that makes any sense. But it was definitely a doorway. He then put his hand up, and even though his lips didn't move, I heard his voice, and he said, "It's not your time, little one. It's time you went back." Now, as he said that, I could hear this absolutely amazing sound, and it's something like an orchestra, but almost like a choir, but they were so high-pitched and loud. It was so loud it was in my ears, but it wasn't an uncomfortable loud. It was a beautiful sensation that seemed to go through every part of me and calm me down. And I just wanted to hear it forever and ever. And again the man said, "You need to go back. You are fine. It's not your time." And he smiled, and he brought his hands down, and as he did, I felt this pull from the stomach area, and immediately felt intense pain, and I realised I was laying in my bed. The sound had gone, and I could hear the ward, I could hear the nurses, the doctors, and there was a doctor standing near the bed, but not right in front. And I was confused. When I came round properly, I heard the doctor talking to my mum and my dad. And it seemed that I'd been down in the theatre for about 6 hours. I couldn't hear it all, but they did explain it to me at a later date. They didn't want to frighten me when I was only 11 years old. But what they said happened was I had a bleed out from the appendix, that it had burst, and they was cleaning it out, and there was a blood vessel that started to pump blood out, and they had to find it and mend it and sew me up. And in that time I had in fact passed away, and they had to bring me back. And back then it was brutal. I mean, we're talking about the early 70s, and so they actually caused a lot of bruising and marks around my body where they'd been pumping me. And so that's when I said to the doctor that was there, and remember, he's an adult and he's talking to a child, and I said, I heard what you said. I had an experience, and I told him. He was quite flustered about it, and he went off and he said to my mum and dad, she might need a little bit of encouragement not to keep talking about that. It was only the drugs that we pumped into her, and you need to get that across to her because it was nothing else. But I knew things. For example, that nurse in the operating theatre, I knew that her hair was stuck up and she had 2 pins holding it in place. I knew the time in the theatre. I knew what lights were broken in the ward and that the curtain was broken. I also saw what they were doing in the theatre, and one man was trying to hold a mask on my face at the same time as trying to grab a drip stand and pull it to him, and he was trying to grab it, and the nurse with the lump on of hair pushed it towards him, and I knew all these things. And so I told him, this doctor. He got really flustered, and a little while later my mum came in to see me, and she said, you know, you've really got to stop all this. But I said, you tell me then, Mum, that nurse over there, because she was working on the ward, whether she was working there or she just brought me back, I don't know, on the bed. I said, look at her hair, and I'm telling you now, she has a lump of hair that didn't sit properly, and it's stuck up, and it's got 2 clips holding it in. So to humour me, she called this nurse over. She said to her, was you in the theatre with my daughter? And the nurse said, yes, I was. She said, would you mind bending your head over? She goes, pardon? Would you mind just putting my daughter's mind at rest? She seems to believe that you were in the theatre and that your hair wasn't quite right. She saw it. Would you mind bending forward? So as she bent forwards, there it was, this lump of hair sticking up with 2 clips in it. She said I had to scurf it back, and I only had 2 pins that I stuck in. Well, you can imagine my mother's face when she saw that. Now, I was lucky because my mother back then, even though she didn't like it, was a very psychic person and didn't like people knowing that, but she knew something had happened, something had gone on. Well, obviously, that's the end of that experience. Now, looking at it from a childhood perspective, The only stuff that I knew about was what I learnt at school, and that was that that man must have been Jesus, that that noise I heard must have been angels, and the floating, well, must have been my spirit. It brought me into a sense of wanting to understand some sort of spirituality, and that's when I had my first looking into scriptures. But that didn't last long. I wanted to know other things, and I did look at other books about other religions, other ways of spirituality, but at that time it was basically all I knew. And so I deemed it that that must have been Jesus, because he had beautiful eyes, beautiful smile, he didn't speak with his mouth, and he had this ring around him, and he held his hand up. So that, looking at it from that point of view, yes. The angels singing, possibility. It was beautiful. Nothing I'd ever heard in life. But I can look at it from another perspective now. I can look at it that that was maybe Balder standing there telling me I couldn't go to hell. Or the noise I heard could have been the trumpets and the noise of the Valkyries coming to collect me, because they collected certain people to take to hell. That beautiful noise could have been the sounds of the gods. And the floating, well, obviously I was going on my journey, seeing the things I saw was the last remnants of the place where I was living. But what I can tell you was, even though I was frightened, I wasn't frightened about the state I was in or what had happened. I was just scared because I couldn't control where I was going and that I was floating and I couldn't work out how to get where I wanted to get. So I can honestly say there was no fear of what had happened, or maybe not coming back. That didn't even enter my mind. And you could look and take any form of religious belief and let it fit into that. You can make anything fit if you want to. So yeah, that's all I'm going to talk about today, guys. I am going through a bit of a difficult time, and I'm having some tests done and procedures, and it's taking it out of me physically at the moment. But I still want to upload and give you something, and I know today's video is not really anything to do with the witchcraft, but I wanted to bring in the Nordic stuff. I wanted to bring in the thought pattern for anybody really who's going through a scary time, by giving out what happened to me, that there was no fear of that, will help others. I did feel that Freya was saying to me, it's an experience, share it. It's an experience that may help somebody out there. Anyone that's been watching my content regularly but hasn't actually subscribed, would you please consider doing so, because it will help the channel to reach more people. I thank those that do watch my content regularly. I really do appreciate you. And when I get through what I'm going through at the moment, I will get back to doing some more of the gods and goddesses. And if you do want specific things, please just put it down in the comment, and I will always try to oblige. So thank you to any new subscribers, welcome. I hope you get something out of this video. I always go by my gut instinct and what I feel Freya is telling me, because at the end of the day, that's how I work. Anyway guys, I will be back Friday and we will try to do another live. I'm going to leave it there guys. I hope you have a lovely week, whatever you're doing. So wherever you are, whatever time of day, night or evening it may be, I wish you the best ever. House of Belang.